Before The Simpsons became visually unchanging, it was almost unrecognizable. Characters quietly warped from shot to shot, animation rules to stop Bart from accidentally turning into a different child. Some visual mistakes were left in permanently because fixing them was too expensive. What looks like one consistent art style is actually decades of invisible fixes, forced compromises, and technical resets that most viewers never notice. But without them, the show wouldn't still exist. The visual evolution of The Simpsons starts before it was even a television series. In 1987, the family first appeared as short, 1-minute animated segments on The Tracey Ullman Show. These shorts were created under extreme time pressure using traditional hand-drawn cell animation. Matt Groening supplied rough sketches, which a tiny animation team directly traced and animated. The result was jagged line work, inconsistent proportions, and characters that visibly shifted shape from shot to shot. Homer's outline could change mid-scene. Bart's spikes sometimes rearranged themselves. Nobody was happy, but everyone was busy enough to ignore it. When the shorts were expanded into a full half-hour series, those problems became impossible to hide. Season 1 required the team to redesign the characters so they could rotate, emote, and exist in three-dimensional space without falling apart. Rounded heads replaced sharp angles, limbs became simpler. Model sheets were introduced to stop animators accidentally inventing new versions of the family every episode. Even then, the designs were described internally as deceptively simple, meaning one wrong pencil stroke could turn Bart into an unrelated child. This era also locked in choices that would define the show forever. Characters were given 4 fingers to reduce drawing time. Skin was colored yellow so the family would instantly stand out while channel surfing, and because it conveniently functioned as both skin and hair for balding characters. The bulging white eyes, always pointing forward rather than crossing, became mandatory. By the end of Season 2, The Simpsons had evolved from a rough sketch experiment into a controlled production system. Still imperfect, but finally recognizable as itself. Once the show survived its early seasons, the biggest priority shifted from invention to control. By seasons 2 through 5, The Simpsons built an enormous internal style Bible, hundreds of pages detailing exactly how every character could move, emote, and exist without accidentally mutating. Lisa's hair was governed by an 8-point rule. Eyes could never cross. Mouth shapes were cataloged, so expressions stayed readable without drifting into Disney-style exaggeration. This wasn't artistic preciousness, it was survival. Without strict rules, the show would collapse under its own production scale. Animation during this period deliberately rejected the elastic movement seen in Looney Tunes or Disney films. Characters were limited, restrained, and occasionally stiff by design. Fluid animation was saved for emphasis, anger, panic, or physical comedy, so when motion did loosen, it landed harder. The team even studied Kermit the Frog as a reference point, focusing on how minimal mouth movement could still convey emotion. Subtlety became a weapon rather than a limitation. Background art also matured. Early Springfield locations felt flat and theatrical, as if characters were standing in front of painted boards. By the mid-90s, perspective improved, depth increased, and environments began to feel lived in rather than drawn 5 minutes before airtime. Moe's Tavern stopped looking like a cardboard box with stools. The town gained visual continuity, making repeated locations feel stable instead of suspiciously rebuilt each week. By the time the show reached its cultural peak in the 1990s, the visual style had stabilized into what most people now call classic Simpsons. Lines were thin but controlled. Colors were limited but deliberate. Movement was economical but expressive. The show finally knew exactly what it was, and just as importantly, what it was not. By the mid-1990s, The Simpsons was still animated using traditional ink and paint cells, even as most television animation quietly prepared to abandon them. This wasn't nostalgia, it was inertia. Cell animation was expensive, slow, physically fragile, and required literal stacks of painted plastic. But it was also what the production pipeline had been built around from day one. Changing it meant breaking everything that already barely worked. The first cracks appeared in Season 7. Specific episodes began quietly experimenting with digital paint and compositing, most notably scenes that would have been impractical or borderline impossible with physical cells. Large crowd duplication, complex camera moves, and layered visual effects were tested in isolation, often buried inside Halloween specials, where visual inconsistency could be blamed on spooky nonsense rather than technological panic. One episode used digital techniques to clone Homer repeatedly. something that would have required an unmanageable number of cell layers using the old process. These experiments exposed the limits of cell animation in very practical terms. There was a physical maximum to how many layers could be stacked before shadows, warping, and dust ruined the image. Digital compositing removed that ceiling entirely. It also solved a quieter but constant problem: mistakes. Under the CL system, incorrect colors or mispainted elements were often left unfixed because repainting was too expensive. Digital coloring allowed rapid correction, cheaper revisions, and fewer episodes permanently haunted by the wrong shade of yellow. By the early 2000s, the switch was no longer optional. The show transitioned fully to digital coloring, marking the end of the cell era. Early digital episodes looked harsher at first: thicker black outlines, crisper edges, and flatter lighting. But those problems were technical, not artistic. Line weights were recalibrated, camera scaling issues were fixed, and within a few seasons the digital look stopped feeling new and started feeling invisible, which, in television animation, is the goal. By the time The Simpsons reached the mid-2000s, the show had already solved television animation. The problem was that television was no longer the ceiling. The Simpsons movie forced the production team to confront something they had carefully avoided for decades. What happens when Springfield is blown up to cinema scale? A design that worked on a living room television would not survive being projected onto a screen the size of a building. Early discussions briefly considered fully computer-generated animation. That idea died quickly. The show's identity was inseparable from its two-dimensional look, and switching entirely to 3D would have turned the film into a very expensive identity crisis. Instead, the team built a hybrid pipeline. Characters remained hand-drawn in 2D, while environments, vehicles, crowds, and complex camera moves quietly used 3D models underneath. The trick was to make none of this obvious, which required an uncomfortable amount of effort. The movie also expanded the show's visual language in ways television never allowed. A much larger color palette was introduced. Backgrounds gained texture, lighting variation, and depth. Characters received consistent tone shadows and drop shadows in every scene, not just at night or during dramatic moments. This added separation between foreground and background, guiding the viewer's eye through each shot rather than flattening everything into a single plane. Widescreen composition changed everything. Shots were staged cinematically rather than functionally. Camera movement became smoother and more deliberate, emulating multiplane camera techniques that previously would have been impractical. Importantly, none of this disappeared after the credits rolled. The film acted as a visual trial run. Many of its upgrades, lighting philosophy, compositional depth, and digital scene planning, were quietly absorbed back into the television series, permanently raising its visual ceiling. The transition to high definition was not a celebratory upgrade, it was a forced rebuild. When The Simpsons moved to HD in its 20th season, the increased resolution exposed every shortcut the show had relied on for nearly 2 decades. Backgrounds that once passed inspection now looked unfinished. Tiny props that used to read as texture became obvious scribbles. The margin for error collapsed overnight. HD also destroyed the show's visual recycling system. For years, animators reused background paintings, establishing shots, and location layouts to save time. None of those assets were usable in the new format. Entire locations, Moe's Tavern, the Quickie Mart, the town square, had to be rebuilt from scratch at higher fidelity. This wasn't artistic ambition, it was basic survival. Old material physically could not scale up without falling apart on screen. The shift from a 4x3 frame to 16x9 was equally disruptive. Wider compositions demanded more visual information, whether it was background clutter, asymmetry, or environmental storytelling. Shots could no longer rely on perfectly centered characters against blank walls. Frames needed balance. Negative space became intentional rather than accidental. Even jokes had to be staged differently because the audience could now see too much to ignore. The opening sequence was redesigned for the first time in years, and the result divided viewers. Movement appeared stiffer, not because the animators forgot how to animate, but because the team had limited time and budget to rebuild the entire show while keeping it on the air. Over subsequent seasons, the animation loosened again as artists adapted to HD tools. What looked like decline was actually recalibration, learning how to be The Simpsons all over again, but in a format that refused to forgive mistakes. In the seasons following the HD transition, The Simpsons entered a quieter phase of evolution. There was no single technological leap, no dramatic redesign, just constant micro-adjustments. Line weights were refined to avoid harsh digital edges. Shadow usage was repeatedly pulled back after going too far. Color tones were subtly varied while still orbiting the same limited palette that had defined the show since the 1980s. Nothing was allowed to drift far enough to feel unfamiliar. Character movement slowly regained fluidity. Early HD episodes had a reputation for stiffness, largely because artists were still adjusting to new pipelines and tighter visual scrutiny. Over time, animation loosened without returning to exaggerated motion. The philosophy remained intact. Restraint first, expressiveness second. When characters stretch, shake, or snap, it is still deliberate rather than constant, preserving the show's understated physical comedy. Older character models were also quietly corrected. When long-absent characters returned, their early designs often looked oversized or misshapen compared to modern standards. Comic Book Guy, for example, had to be scaled down to match contemporary proportions. Sets were refreshed with new background jokes, extra signage, and environmental details that rewarded widescreen viewing without overwhelming it. Springfield became denser, not busier. Even the opening couch gags evolved into a visual laboratory. Guest animators, experimental art styles, and fan-created sequences allowed the show to briefly bend its rules without breaking them. These segments acted as pressure valves, letting the series experiment visually while keeping the core episodes stable. After more than 3 decades, The Simpsons still adjusts its appearance, not because it is chasing relevance, but because standing still would be far more noticeable. Despite the characters remaining frozen in age, the visual language of The Simpsons has never stopped moving. That contradiction is intentional. The family cannot age, but the world around them must. Technology inside the show updates. Background details change. Cultural references shift. Even Springfield itself quietly absorbs modernity while pretending it always looked that way. The animation has to support that illusion without drawing attention to itself, which is significantly harder than it sounds. The production pipeline today is a layered hybrid of everything that came before it. Hand-drawn character animation still forms the backbone, but digital planning tools now handle complex camera moves, crowd scenes, and perspective-heavy environments. 3D elements are used sparingly and usually invisibly, supporting shots rather than announcing their presence. The goal is consistency, not spectacle. When viewers notice the animation, something has probably gone wrong. What makes this phase unique is restraint. The show could radically redesign itself, smooth everything out, modernize proportions, or lean harder into digital expressiveness. It chooses not to. Instead, it preserves a recognizable silhouette while making incremental corrections that most viewers never consciously register. Shadows are adjusted. Colors are balanced. Motion is nudged rather than reinvented. The evolution happens in fractions, not leaps. After more than 3 decades, The Simpsons exists in a permanent state of revision. It is never finished, never locked, and never fully settled. The animation continues to adapt because it has to, because high-definition formats, new display technologies, and changing production standards leave no room for nostalgia-driven stagnation. The show survives by quietly rebuilding itself while insisting nothing has changed at all. The reason The Simpsons has survived for over 3 decades is not that it found a perfect visual style and froze it. It is that the show learned how to change without looking like it was changing. Every era introduced constraints, time pressure, budget limits, new formats, higher resolution, and each constraint forced adaptation. The animation evolved not to chase trends, but to prevent the show from visibly aging while the medium around it moved forward. What looks like visual consistency is actually constant maintenance. Colors are rebalanced so they read correctly on modern screens. Line thickness is tuned so characters do not look brittle in ultra-high definition. Background density is increased so widescreen shots feel intentional rather than empty. None of these adjustments are dramatic, but skipping them would be immediately noticeable. The show survives by doing the work audiences never see. This philosophy also explains why The Simpsons has resisted major stylistic reboots. A radical redesign would date the show instantly, locking it to a specific era of television aesthetics. Incremental evolution avoids that trap. Each season quietly absorbs new production realities while preserving the same silhouettes, facial logic, and movement rules established decades earlier. The result is a series that looks simultaneously old and current, familiar and slightly revised, unchanged and constantly rebuilt. The characters never age, but the animation never stops adapting. That tension between stasis and movement is not a flaw. It is the mechanism that keeps the show functional after more than 30 years of television, refusing to stand still.